The invitation came casually, almost without thought, when Daniel mentioned that I should spend the weekend at his house. We had been friends since our early teens, bound by shared classes and late-night video game marathons, and it seemed natural that I would occasionally stay over. His house was larger than mine, more elegant in its structure, a quiet suburban home where time seemed to move at its own unhurried pace. I agreed, unaware that this ordinary visit would slip into something far more complicated than either of us could have imagined. The day I arrived, the house carried a warmth that wasn't merely from the autumn sun spilling through wide windows. Daniel greeted me at the door with his usual grin, but behind him stood his father, Michael, whose presence instantly shifted the air. Tall, broad-shouldered, with lines of experience etched into his face, he extended a hand in greeting. His handshake was firm, steady, and lingered just a second longer than necessary. "Glad to have you with us," Michael said, his voice low, confident, with a timbre that seemed to settle deep in my chest. I returned his smile politely, yet I couldn't deny the immediate awareness his presence stirred in me. Daniel chatted on about where we'd set up my things, about the snacks waiting upstairs, oblivious to the way his father's steady gaze traced me for a moment before turning away. Upstairs, Daniel's room was cluttered, comfortably lived in. We wasted time as we always did, playing music too loudly and laughing about inside jokes that had long stopped being funny but still carried nostalgia. For a while, it felt like any other weekend, yet the memory of Michael's handshake remained, lingering like a spark I couldn't quite ignore. Dinner brought us together again. Michael sat at the head of the table, speaking with a casual authority that filled the space. His wife was away visiting relatives, and though Daniel barely noticed, the absence made me acutely aware of the triangular dynamic forming between father, son, and guest. We ate roasted chicken with vegetables, the scent of herbs strong in the air. Michael asked me about school, my interests, and my plans for the future. His questions were simple, but the way he listened directly, intently, was disarming. At one point, our eyes met across the table. His expression was unreadable, yet I felt something pass between us, something I was certain Daniel couldn't see. My fork clattered slightly against the plate, and I quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in conversation. Later, after dishes were cleared, Daniel suggested we retreat back upstairs. He was eager to show me a new game, but before following him, I lingered in the kitchen doorway. Michael stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, rinsing plates under running water. He glanced over his shoulder and caught me watching. "Your help's not required," he said with a faint smile, water glistening on his hands. "But it's noticed." I nodded, awkward, and joined Daniel upstairs, but the image stayed with me. Michael's forearms flexing under the strain of simple chores, his voice steady and deliberate. The night wore on until laughter gave way to drowsiness. Daniel fell asleep quickly, sprawled across his bed, leaving me restless in the guest room down the hall. I lay beneath unfamiliar sheets, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the distance. My thoughts circled back to Michael again and again. The handshake, the gaze, the smile in the kitchen. It was nothing, I told myself, just ordinary moments, easily misinterpreted. And yet, my chest tightened as though those fragments carried more weight than I dared admit. I shifted under the blanket, trying to will myself into sleep when the floorboard outside my door creaked. A soft, deliberate sound, then silence. My breath caught, every sense alert. Seconds passed, stretching long, until the faint shuffle of footsteps moved away, descending the hall. I lay motionless, my heart racing. Perhaps it was nothing, just a house settling in the night, or Michael checking that doors were locked. Still, the pause at my door lingered in my mind, unsettling and electric, as though the boundary between possibility and restraint had thinned by the smallest degree. And in that charged quiet, I realized this weekend would not pass as innocently as I had believed. Morning light spilled across the guest room, pulling me from uneasy dreams. I dressed quickly, trying to shake the strange weight of the night before. When I stepped into the hallway, Daniel's room was empty, his bed hastily made. The sound of car keys jingling downstairs explained it. He was already heading out. Back in a couple hours, Daniel called as he slipped on his sneakers. "Dad's around if you need anything." The front door shut, and silence folded over the house. I was suddenly acutely aware that Michael and I were alone together. I found him in the living room, reading the morning paper, glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up when I entered, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Sleep well?" he asked. I hesitated before nodding. "Well enough." He set the paper aside, motioning toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" The offer was ordinary, but something in his tone made it feel like more. I followed him, watching as he moved with practiced ease, grinding beans, pouring water, filling the room with the earthy scent of coffee. His presence seemed to command the space without effort. We sat at the small breakfast table, steam curling between us. At first, the conversation was simple: school, part-time jobs, vague plans for the future. But soon the tone shifted. Michael leaned forward, eyes fixed on me, as if weighing each word. "You ever feel," he said slowly, "like people only see the version of you they expect? And if you show them anything else, they wouldn't recognize you at all?" The question startled me with its intimacy. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the mug. All the time, I admitted, "I think that's most of why I keep things to myself." His gaze softened. "It gets lonely hiding pieces of yourself." There was a pause. In that stillness, the air between us thickened with something unspoken. I wanted to look away, but his eyes held me in place. The conversation wandered further: his strained marriage, his sense of being overlooked, even within his own home. He spoke quietly, not with bitterness, but with weariness, as though these truths rarely left his mouth. I listened, heart pounding, aware of how dangerous it was to be the keeper of his confessions. When I shared fragments of my own fears, my uncertainty about who I was and how others would see me, his hand reached across the table, resting gently over mine. The contact was simple, human, but the effect rippled through me like fire. I should have pulled away. Instead, I stayed. His thumb brushed once against my knuckles, deliberate and tender. The silence that followed was charged, carrying every warning and every possibility at once. Michael's voice lowered. "This shouldn't happen." But his hand didn't move, and neither did mine. The moment stretched, precarious and undeniable. He rose slowly, circling the table until he stood beside me. My breath caught as his hand settled on my shoulder, steady but trembling at the edges. "You can walk away now," he murmured, almost pleading. Yet I didn't. The pull between us was stronger than reason, heavier than the guilt already blooming in my chest. I looked up, and in that instant his resolve broke. He leaned down, and our lips met. Hesitant at first, then deepening, urgent, as though we had both been waiting for this without ever daring to admit it. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of his mouth, the press of his body, the rush of crossing a boundary we both knew could never be uncrossed. Every second was layered with contradiction, desire entwined with dread, exhilaration with shame. When it ended, we stood in breathless silence, our foreheads nearly touching. Neither of us spoke. The weight of what we had done settled heavily, yet beneath it pulsed a raw, undeniable truth. We had wanted this. Then the sound of tires crunching on gravel shattered the moment. Daniel's car was back in the driveway. Michael stepped back instantly, his expression shuddering, his composure reassembling as though nothing had happened. My pulse hammered as I scrambled to steady my breathing, to erase every trace of what had just passed between us. The front door opened. Daniel's voice carried up the hall, careless and unaware. I forced a smile, but inside everything had changed. Daniel bounded into the kitchen with the same careless energy I had always known. He dropped a plastic bag of groceries on the counter and began rambling about the errands he had run, his voice filling the silence that had only moments before been heavy with tension. I forced a laugh, nodding along, while my pulse still thundered from what had just happened. Michael, across the room, moved with practiced calm, as if nothing unusual had occurred. His hands busied themselves with unpacking the groceries, but I noticed the slight stiffness in his movements, the way he avoided looking at me too, directly. The three of us shared lunch not long after. Daniel was oblivious, chattering about his plans for the evening, while I sat torn between guilt and an aching awareness of Michael's nearness. Every so often, our eyes met briefly, fleeting, almost accidental, but each glance carried the weight of the secret now lodged between us. That evening, Daniel retreated upstairs, lost in a new video game. I lingered in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone. Michael was there too, reading again, though his attention seemed only half on the page. The quiet between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable, more like the echo of something that could not be named aloud. Finally, he closed the book and spoke, his voice low. "What happened earlier, it can't happen again." I nodded, though the memory of his lips still burned against mine. "I know." But knowing didn't erase the truth. We both sat there, the words unsaid louder than the ones spoken. I wanted to ask if he regretted it, if it meant anything beyond a stolen moment, but fear held me still. Dinner was a blur of routine. Daniel joked, Michael answered casually, and I forced myself to match their rhythm, though every sound and movement felt staged. The normalcy was almost unbearable because beneath it pulsed a truth none of us could afford to acknowledge. Later, as night settled in, I prepared for bed in the guest room. The air felt heavier than the night before. I lay in the dark, thoughts racing, when a soft knock tapped against the door. My breath caught. Michael stepped inside, quietly, his silhouette framed by the faint light of the hallway. He closed the door behind him, his face shadowed, his voice barely a whisper. "I shouldn't be here," he said. Yet he was, and I didn't ask him to leave. He didn't come closer this time, only stood by the door as though some invisible line tethered him there. "What happened between us, it stays between us. Daniel can't know. No one can." His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed conflict, desire, guilt, fear, and something softer, all tangled together. I sat up in bed, my voice low but certain. "I understand." For a moment, silence stretched, then he gave a small nod, turned, and slipped back into the hallway, leaving me with the echo of his words. The next morning was filled with ordinary motions, breakfast, small talk, laughter between friends. Daniel remained cheerfully unaware, but every glance I exchanged with Michael was loaded, heavy with what neither of us dared to voice. When it was time to leave, Daniel clapped me on the shoulder, promising another weekend soon. I smiled, though part of me knew it would never be so simple again. At the door, Michael stood behind his son, composed as ever. Our eyes met for the briefest instant. No words were exchanged, but in that glance lay an entire story: desire and regret, secrecy and memory, something both forbidden and unforgettable. As I stepped down the porch steps, Daniel calling after me, I carried with me not just a weekend with a friend, but the burden of a truth that could never be spoken. And though guilt pressed heavily against my chest, another feeling pulsed just as strong. The quiet knowledge that in Michael's arms, if only for a moment, I had glimpsed a version of myself I hadn't known existed. It was a secret I would keep, but one that would mark me forever. The days after that weekend unfolded with a strange duality. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Daniel and I returned to school, exchanged jokes in the hallways, and spoke about exams and weekend plans as though everything was untouched. But within me, a secret pulsed like a hidden flame, its heat impossible to ignore. I found myself studying him more carefully than ever before, his easy laugh, his unguarded innocence, and each time, guilt gnawed deeper. He had no idea what had transpired under his own roof, no inkling of the quiet betrayal that had folded itself between me and his father. And yet, every time Daniel looked at me with trust in his eyes, I felt the sharp edge of what I had risked. Michael haunted me even more. In the stillness of night, I replayed every moment. The brush of his hand across mine, the whispered words, the weight of his presence when he stood at my door. His face lingered in my mind like an indelible mark, carved with both desire and warning. 2 weeks later, Daniel invited me over again. I hesitated, inventing excuses, but he pressed, confused at my reluctance. Finally, I agreed, knowing full well what awaited me. When I arrived, the house felt at once familiar and perilous. Daniel rushed upstairs with his usual enthusiasm, already lost in plans for another gaming marathon. Michael was in the living room, reading by the soft glow of a lamp. He looked up when I entered, and in that fleeting glance the world tilted. "Good to see you again," he said, calm, measured. The words were ordinary, but the silence beneath them was not. Later, while Daniel shouted from his room for me to join him, I lingered in the hallway, caught between two worlds. Michael passed by, close enough that his arm brushed mine. The contact was slight, almost accidental, yet it carried the weight of memory. That night, lying awake once more in the guest room, I thought about the line we had crossed and the one still unspoken. Was it only desire, a fleeting moment of weakness? Or had something deeper taken root, something neither of us dared to name? The house was quiet except for Daniel's faint laughter upstairs. Then came the sound again, footsteps outside my door. This time I rose, hand on the knob, heart pounding. But the steps moved past, fading into the distance. He wasn't coming in. He had chosen restraint. Relief and disappointment tangled inside me. The next morning, as I prepared to leave, Michael stood by the door while Daniel searched for his keys. His voice was low, almost inaudible. "Take care of yourself." I met his gaze, searching for meaning. There was no smile this time, only a solemn acknowledgement of the storm we had stirred. On the ride home, I realized the story was unfinished. What happened between us would never be spoken, yet it would live on in glances, in silences, in the fragile balance of what could have been and what should never be. And as much as I longed for closure, part of me knew I didn't want it. The memory of Michael's touch would remain, dangerous, intoxicating, impossible to erase. It was not love, not in the way stories like to pretend. It was something darker and sharper. A truth about desire, secrecy, and the human need to be seen. And though I told myself I could walk away, I knew the next time Daniel asked me to stay, I would say yes.